So today I was cutting up some windfall trees to create wood for my wood pile to burn in my wood burning stove to keep myself warm during the winter without having recourse to the wider American economy, which, if you can get away with, is always a good idea. And while I was doing that, I was listening to an interview between Nick Mason and Timothy Kelly on Tim Kelly's YouTube channel about American foreign policy in the 20th century, and particularly the change from American non interventionism to American interventionism. And what I came away with was the idea that every American entanglement, as they used to be called, with every new American entanglement, there is another change in the domestic life of the American people. So if you get into World War One, then not only do you have a bunch of dead soldiers and a bunch of bereaved families, but you also have a bunch of debt that you never actually pay off. If you get involved in World War Two, then you get a whole bunch of new people coming to America that have a different culture than America and never do assimilate, and in some circumstances dominate American life in some fields. You also get an American empire established that we can never get rid of and draws us into further entanglements. Um, the Cold War, people have to give up their domestic freedoms, domestic political freedoms in some respects, and they either get poisoned or assassinated by their own um, domestic security services. And most famously, most recently, with the so-called War on Terror, you get an American spy state, the likes of which had never been envisioned in the wildest dreams of science fiction authors previously. That's the regime we're living under right now. So, we don't like this, and we don't like all of the concurrent social changes that have come with it. Um, we don't like the fact that things that would have been classified as mental illness 30 years ago are now being promoted as state policy in primary education and other places, and that we're just kind of inching towards hate speech, and the people who are coming up with the definitions of what hate speech is are opposed to every value that you and I hold. And all of this would horrify your grandparents and great grandparents, who incidentally were all right people. They weren't that bad. So I came away with these thoughts, and also the idea that American foreign policy, everybody understands that it's only the product of elites. The will of the American public is never considered when it comes to American foreign policy. And we know that because American involvement in World War One and World War Two, it was extremely unpopular, and yet we did it anyway, even though the president the president who won had run on an anti-war platform and then got us into war in both cases. So that was the subject of their talk. But then at the end, Nick Mason asked Timothy Kelly a very difficult question. And the question was, if the America First Party in the 1930s was unable to successfully express itself and exert itself politically, if they failed then in the 1930s, then what in the hell are we going to do? Because they had much more going for them. They had much more in their favor. They were living in the kind of society that we think that we need in order to be successful politically. So a lot of folks want to roll back the clock to something with a more traditional, more conservative way of life in order that you could have a better political outcome. But they couldn't do it in the 1930s, so where does that leave us? And Timothy Kelly struggled with an answer to that question because it's really, really difficult. But these tough questions have to be answered, and they have to be answered honestly, even if we don't like what it looks like. But both of them, they very firmly said that they're not hopeless and they're not overly cynical. But we really don't know what the answer is to this question. And I wanted to bring in some of the material from the Gumilyov book, Ethnogenesis and the Biosphere, that I've been reading, because I think it bears directly on this question of what's going to happen next and how are we going to be more successful. Tim Kelly said that America as a proposition nation, that's what he called it, and I think he's right to do so. The current idea of what it means to be an American is that you sign a piece of paper and that you have certain ideas floating around in your head, and then you have certain market preferences about buying and selling, and that's pretty much all there is to it. We know in reality that if you're a Somali who's just come off the boat, you are probably not going to be able to function as what everybody would have recognized an American citizen's rights and responsibilities were 50 years ago. It's unreasonable. And it's unreasonable because the liberal idea, this notion that you just need a few ideas and a few market preferences and everything will work itself out all right, is totally a fraud. The way that Gumilyov sets all this stuff up in his book is that the ethnos is a successful ethnos, one that's going to live, is a community of people who are an interbreeding population. They share a language, religion, and culture. And only in that context will they be able to develop a strong political leadership and the institutions of public life that will allow them to not be either conquered or totally subsumed by another group. The American identity is completely operating within the liberal conception, and you can see the success of it in that most Americans are depressed and unhappy. It doesn't matter whether they're on the left or the right, or what exactly they are politically. Nobody's optimistic about the future, and it's because they don't have a strong sense of who they are and where they're going ethnically. And Gumilyov wrote in his book, I think persuasively, at least to me, that you have to be rooted within an ethnos in order to have any kind of satisfaction, in order to have direction. You have to place yourself within history, within a culture, within these traditions, and it has to be based on blood. It has to be based on heredity and descent, and then you move forward in history on the basis of what's come before you. He explicitly rejected the racial element, and I understand why he did so. If you think about people trying to organize in terms of race, it has, to my knowledge, never been successful amongst Europeans. Europeans can organize on the basis of being German or Catholic, Christian, or Flemish or Spanish or something like that, or you can organize along local or regional identities. But Europeans are too ethnically diverse to organize successfully as a racial group. Contrasting that, you know that most ethnic groups are racially homogenous, because if you are a group of human beings that are living as an ethnos, that are sharing culture, values, language, religion, and you're interbreeding with each other, you'll eventually become racially homogenous if you're around long enough. So the racial component is there. It's not enough by itself. So to answer Nick Mason's question, nothing is going to change politically until there's a new ethnic identity in America for former Americans to be a part of. So there's going to have to be something that comes along culturally where people share enough values and enough language and enough culture to get rid of this useless liberal, this damaging, painfully diseased liberal idea and move forward with something else. And I think that what you're seeing the power elite do is to try to keep that from happening. And that's pretty much what all of their media campaigns are about. and also their importation of all kinds of non-European peoples from all over the world. They want to create a brainwashed, multiracial environment so that there is no ethnic identity that can compete with their power structure. Thank you for your time.